Well, good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to keep my screen off, my video off, although I do like to use my hands when I teach, but you'll be okay. Just I'm traveling, doing some training out here in Colorado today, so I don't want to run the chance that we have a problem with our video feed. So uh, throw into the chat the handout for anybody that might be interested in getting it before we get started. Just as a quick bit of housekeeping. We've been doing a lot of our DLI entry. Um, so those have mostly been input already into DLI. Once those are all done into DLI, then you'll get your CEU certificates. We've been trying to get them directly into DLI first. So those have been updated there. Um, but let's go ahead and get started. So today is going to be a class really looking and diving into well, it was really a devil in the details, right? Air barriers and air leakage controls. And so for those of you that aren't necessarily we always get new people, which I think is great, that might not know who we are and what we do. So we're part of the Minnesota Energy Code Support Program, and so we are a utility funded education and resource uh, that's designed to support, educate, and empower building professionals throughout the state in complying with the state's commercial energy and residential energy code compliance, or residential and commercial energy codes. Obviously, residential is still hasn't changed yet, and so that code development process is underway. So we're participating and being a part of that. And then once that's been changed, we have a better clue as to what it's going to look like in the future. We'll jump in on that conversation as well. But what we try to do is this year, beginning of the year, was really trying to break out a lot of these different concepts and put them into a plan review series. So there's a lot of different resources that we provide. If you have any questions, you can always check out our website, log in, check out our technical resources page, look at our different upcoming trainings, both online and in person. There's a variety of different resources out there. And right now, that's, like I said, that first week of every month, we're trying to focus in on plan review specifically. And then the second week, we'll focus in on inspections, breaking up some of these concepts so we can kind of talk more about it in real world. And if you have questions throughout the process, remember this is an interactive conversation. It usually goes best if we talk together versus you just listen to me. If you've been on here long enough, I can talk for a long time. And so please, if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A, pop them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them. I know there was one of the resources that's on our website that might be helpful to you and more helpful to our designers and builders is going to be our commercial plan review checklist. We worked on that in collaboration with the Build Up Minnesota program, which is there. That's the other energy code support program that's out there, really trying to focus on the next generation of code development. And so one of the things that we worked on collaboratively was creating this checklist to help guide a project through that process. So as an individual or as a designer starts to use that, if you have any questions, let me know. If you have, Eugene, I don't know if I've had enough coffee yet. I'm only on cup two, and it's been a long day. I forgot what time zones do to you. But if you do have questions or if you have some critiques about the checklist, please let us know. It's a work in progress. It's a resource. It only makes sense if it works for everybody and works for you. So one of the things that if you do check it out, one of the things you'll notice is as you select a different compliance path, right? If you actually go to the compliance path section, you'll click on it and then you'll be able to click this button one on the right-hand side. A designer could do that and it will eliminate the components that aren't part of their compliance path to help streamline a little bit some of the conversation. And then there's areas for them to put in, how they're meeting it, what page this might be demonstrated on. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of today's plan review class. So again, that's a resource out there. It's free. If you have any questions or if there's something that you need better, one thing we're working on is a short list of mechanical plan review expectations. And how do you do mechanical plan review? incorporating energy code compliance. So it's a great opportunity for everybody. So if you have questions, please let us know, and they are free. So every class I do, I start off with this general belief that when we understand the why, we can figure out the how. And we spent a lot of time last week talking about the design components, the design requirements for air, water, vapor barriers, and kind of guiding us in that question of why, right? Why and how are we going to accomplish that? And one of the things that we figured out is that if we look at the energy code overall, we lower. We talk a lot about the role of insulation and proper insulation installation as one factor in improving the overall efficiency of a building. But we have to understand that air barriers can't be an afterthought, right? When we think about what are the pillars of our energy code compliance, how I love to make it to, maybe this is just the way my brain works, and that's, hopefully you can appreciate that. But my brain starts out at that highest level of what are the four main pillars of code compliance when we think about the energy code, right? Whether it's residential, it's commercial, the four things that we think about. I like the number 4 just because I've got 4 kids, and that's the number of back seats in the car, right? It's anyhow, digression. It's a number that makes sense to me. And so we normally talk about these 4 ideas that are identified in the code: the building thermal envelope, mechanical system, service water, and then the power and lighting controls. And so when we think about those systems, we understand that within that, the thing that drives that conversation is our construction details. I had an interaction with a contractor a couple weeks ago. I deal with a lot of contractors around the country, actually, and so both residential and commercial. And the one I was talking to his name was Ethan Kahn, and I said he's a commercial contractor. And I said, so do you have a copy of the building code? Just asking that general question. And he said, no. Why would I have a copy of the building code? I build what's on the plan. So his attitude was, which I don't disagree entirely. His attitude was, I don't need to pay $800 to get a copy of the building code when it should be on my building plan. I know how to build, and I know how to build to the plan. So if it's on the plan, then I'll do it. If it's not on the plan, I'm not going to go check a book. I'm not the plans guy. That's the building department's job. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, right? I've talked to residential contractors who are very same way. I know how to build a code. I know how to build a house. Why do I need to check a code? Well, interesting take on life, right? Those are usually the same people that says, why do I need a permit? But we won't get into that. That's a whole other conversation. And this week, yesterday, before I got on the plane, I had a meeting with a local jurisdiction and their mayor was asking questions. He's trying to tell me what he wants to accomplish with the building code and their different local codes. And I said, well, your mayor, one of the things you need to understand is that codes are all about one word, and that's control, right? You've heard me say it in any class you've been in. At some point, I'll point out the code is all about control. It's about controlling how buildings are built, how snow loads fall, and or dealt with, and how energy is utilized. And so we understand that the construction details are really going to be that primary vehicle that we use to gain compliance as a building, right? To demonstrate that this building is going to be successful, and it's going to be safe, and it's going to be habitable, it's going to be comfortable, all the things that we want it to do. Despite all of our worst views and opinions of property owners on the macro level, they all understand. Business owners understand that if my employees aren't comfortable in the context of what they're doing, they're not. Now, not that we're all getting lazy boys, although I would say if there's a city manager on the phone online today, if you want to buy your building department lazy boy recliner chairs, I think it's a great idea. But not that everybody needs a lazy boy to be comfortable, but at the same time, we understand that you're more productive when you're not complaining about being cold or hot, right? And so it's all a level of control and understanding how we execute that control. And that building thermal envelope is part of the control system that allows us to properly design a mechanical system. Mechanical design is the thing that uses the most energy, right? We know this from Minnesota, especially, right? If it's, the mechanical system is the primary energy user in a building's design, and so we make certain assumptions. And I think when we talk about mechanical design, we make certain assumptions about how that building is going to operate. And one of those key components is how much air leakage am I going to have? We do if you look at mechanical design, which we'll do mechanical systems in a couple of weeks, but when we look at mechanical system design, we are calculating what we expect that building to lose and to gain with outside of our controls that are outside of our control, right? And the more that we have, if we assume a certain amount of air leakage and then we get twice that air leakage, then our mechanical system, our design is going to be off. It's going to be off. We're going to overcompensate. We're going to be underperforming and have to and do more work. So again, that's part of that understanding. And as we move forward in the future, I see, again, I'm part of I just had a meeting, was yesterday at the airport. I was at the airport listening to the commercial 2027 IECC commercial consensus process, which I know is not in Minnesota, but the main thing they were talking about from the mechanical provisions was refining how we see that building, right? Refining how the mechanical system works and getting closer to an understanding of what are a realistic levels of overage. And that's what the code is all about, right? When we think about these things, if we were looking at cars, it's not about changing the way we design. Buildings still have 4 walls and a roof. What's the difference from today versus 50 years ago is the level of refinement in what we're expecting that building to do. And part of that construction detail, a long-winded part of intro, is about showing us what information is going to be provided in those documents, right? We think about it in this context. We want to know up front who's going to be testing, what type of testing is going to go into it, what kind of, verification. Remember, we've said this before. If I know there's a test, if I told you there's a test at the end of this class, you'd probably click off and say, you know what, I'll get next week, right? Or I'll go to a different one. But by knowing you're going to pay attention, participate, and make sure it's done right. And so we want to know who those tests are going to be, who's doing that testing, as we'll talk about a little bit later. That's going to be critical to understand as we think about it in that long-term success, right? If I know who's coming, then they know when to come, right? Digression. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. We got a lot of slides to get through or conversations to have, right? The second piece is always going to be knowing what our compliance path is. Even when we think about energy code or air barriers, compliance path is going to be critical. Are we just following a very basic understanding of air leakage, or are we using one of these energy cost or Appendix G performance paths where we have to have even greater control over our building's air intake, our air infiltration? We'll see an example of that here in a little bit. And again, we understand the code tells us we have to have these insulation materials, but it also gets into this concept of air sealing and the air barrier, right? It has to be something we identify, because if we know where it's at, we can pay attention for it, right? If I know, when I was driving up here, and I'm in Denver today, right? I was on I-25. I knew I was looking for exit 227. Don't ask me why that number still sticks in my head after a night of sleep, but I was driving to 227. It was a 53-mile drive. So when I'm driving, I'm not paying attention for the first 40 miles because I know that exit 227 is 53 miles away. About 45 minutes in, I'm going to start looking for little cues, right? I know where the line is. I know when I need to start paying attention to it. Same concept in our building. If I know where that envelope is going to be, then I start to worry, then I'll start to be prepared for it. If I know my building thermal envelope is all the way here in the exterior wall, and I'm insulating this interior wall between the women's and the bathroom or the receiving in the bathroom, I'm not worried about maybe as much the level of installation or air barrier controls in this space, right? If I'm doing something here to this wall or this hallway, and it's not part of my air barrier, my thermal envelope, then I'd have more flexibility in what I'm expecting. And as an inspector, I know I'm not going to be paying too much attention to the insulation that exists between the vendor receiving area and the hot dog stand, right? That's, we're using my favorite example. So it really does become a question of, understanding where it is. And like you said, like I said, I always see everything in the world of four. So we have our four key pillars of energy code compliance, and within that building thermal envelope, we talk about envelope location, insulation, fenestration, and then air leakage controls. When we break that insulation, that air leakage control down even further, right? The code tells us that's one of our mandatory considerations is the insulation, the fenestration, and the air leakage. When we start to break that down even further, we'll see here in a second, I still do it again in four, right? We understand that when there's envelope alterations, when we change an envelope, we think about, again, that same insulation, air leakage, and fenestration, right? Whether we're replacing windows or doors or whole wall systems, when we actually alter them, right, we're thinking about how do we impact our overall air control, air leakage control. It's all about control. So when we start to think, what are we looking for in our building, right? We said we look for these things, but when we think about the air barrier, right, I still break it out into four things. You notice it's very similar, right? Then I'm looking for location, materials, penetration, not fenestration. And again, instead of air leakage controls, it's air leakage testing. So again, in my brain, there's the four pillars, and under those four pillars, there's usually four things that I'm looking for. And here in the air barriers, there's four things again. I'm looking for the air barrier location. I'm looking for what material and how it was installed. And then I'm looking for how we deal with penetration. That right there is going to be the thing that 9 times out of 10 drives you up a wall as a plans examiner. Because when you're, especially as a smaller jurisdiction, where you see the plan and then you go out and you see the inspection, you're like, well, that's not what did this work out right? Right, that's a penetration that's not necessarily identified or considered in the plans, right? That's what gets my brain going the most, actually, And then, again, that concept of testing. Now, remember what we're talking about is, again, how are we isolating, protecting not only the building through the exterior wall envelope from the environment around our building, but then also how are we isolating or insulating? I think I went the wrong direction. The energy code takes it that next step further and says what we're trying to do is separate conditioned space from semi-heated space, right? We have a lot of large warehouse facilities that are considered semi-heated, right? They're not fully conditioned, but their main office area is conditioned. And so it's really about isolating and identifying where we need to have these isolations between our conditioned and our semi and heated spaces. And so again, if you're the determination of whether or not something is unconditioned is again defers to the building official to determine what is those separation expectations. But the first thing we always ask is where is that envelope, right? Is that envelope the exterior wall system, right? This is the critical conversation. We see it all the time. We've asked it all the time. And so a lot of times I'll generate a comment that says something similar to this. Please provide depiction of the air barrier location as specified in, and then up I've left up. This is from a different project. So ignore the improper code reference, right? This would be 5.4.3, right? And provide air leakage testing method, air leakage controls, air barrier material specifications is provided further. I specify further, right? So when this plan went out, and this is why I used that one instead of correcting it to our normal Minnesota specific one. When that comment went out, this was the response. Please refer to the added sheet A171 for the air barrier plan. Please refer to added document 007 complete specification manual, section 072419 for fluid applied air barrier. Right? This information wasn't provided. It wasn't that I was lazy and didn't see it. It wasn't even incorporated into the spec book. And so again, what we see is we get an extra page added where we've identified, no, this is not the same convenience stores. It's a different convenience store, right? Convenience stores are my favorite just because they're simple and common. And so we see identified this air barrier that extends all the way out because again, they've got this vestibule. Is this vestibule part of the conditioned space or an unconditioned space or a semi-heated space? Again, this is the same thing that we see in a lot of different restaurants where you have this little access room, right? And so the question becomes, what are we trying to accomplish? And so this brings up more questions in my mind, actually, about, well, if this is the air barrier, then is this my thermal envelope? What's the relationship between the two? Because if my vestibule is separated by a semi-heated space, right? If I have a conditioned space on the inside, right? Conditioned means heating and cooling. And I have a semi-heated space with just heating, right? And just heating here, then is my entrance now to the exterior? So it really starts to drive that conversation about understanding what's going on and why are we trying to protect it, right? We want to keep all the air we can inside the building as much as possible. We want to have these little air curtains or heated vestibules, whatever we're doing to monitor and manage our uncontrolled air loss, right? So we start looking at what those specs start to identify. It brings out the components, right? That we're going to have an air water resistive barrier, how it's going to be applied, what are my expectations? Because it really comes to the question of not just where is the air barrier, but what is that barrier doing? Now, remember, the air barrier is part of this conversation gets into that. We start to move into that idea of identifying materials and designs, because insulation resist heat conduction. Air barriers resist airflow. And it's possible once in a while to have a system that does both, or a component that does both. But more importantly, what we're thinking about in the context of the air, vapor, and water moisture barriers is, what are they trying to do, right? We understand there are varieties of different types of moisture, right? The three phases of water, we talked about this last week: liquid, gas, and solid. And we're trying to resist moisture intrusion into our building, right? That's why we have exterior cladding. That's why you put weather resistant barriers, and that's to resist the transfer of exterior environments into our occupied space or assemblies, right? And we have that same level of control in the interior with the moisture that exists inside our building, right? If we're in a hotel, if we're in a office environment, we all know, if you've been around somebody long enough, we talked about this last week, if you've been around somebody long enough, they'll start to sweat. And that when people breathe, it gets hot, right? If we walk into it, it's interesting to me to once in a while, I'm a dork. And so I will say that up front. It's always interesting to me because I'll usually show up early to a basketball game. Friends of ours, their girls play basketball. So I'll show up early. I'm like, okay, we're here to do our neighborly duty and watch a basketball game because I hate basketball. Don't take it personal if you love basketball, but we'll show up to that basketball game, and what we'll do, I'll usually pay attention more to what's going on. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out where my mouse was. I'll spend more time trying to figure out how much moisture change is in that gym once all the parents get there. And then once all the kids start running around and doing all the exercise, right? You feel the change in humidity, right? And the question I always think is, is this system designed to produce heat, or is this system designed to properly ventilate, right? What was the system designed for? I go to, you go to a lot of assembly spaces, and that question always is always in the back of my mind, right? You know how when you go and sit at a lot of you, especially fire department and fire staff, will go to a restaurant. First thing they're doing is looking for exits and entrances, right? The first thing I usually think about when I get in a big assembly space is, I wonder how this was designed. Was this designed to bring in air and just let it naturally, exfiltrate, or are we actually controlling exhaust, right? Are we monitoring moisture levels, or are we just throwing in heat once in a while? Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. I digress, but part of that is an understanding why we have it and what it's trying to do. Is again why we think about where are these barriers and what are they trying to accomplish. Now, this is again another project that I was doing, and we see here where this is going to follow that residential provisions for the building that's going to be 3 stories or less above grade. Well, you see how they've identified for me in this added sheet that came up later the insulation. If we zoomed in tight, you would see a pink line going around, and then our thermal envelope. Well, that's great. Thanks for identifying the thermal envelope, but I'm asking about air barriers. Well, at the bottom of the page, underneath the images, were some sections of general notes, right, on air barriers. and on building. And so now I can start to read what's going on with the air barrier. And what they've done for the most part is exactly what we expect, what we see in most projects, right? They've copied the code from the code onto the details of the project. And so we get some very basic understanding of continuity of the air barrier. Certain areas need to be sealed. Our expectations, this again, because it was going back to residential, this is what we generally will see from a lot of different projects. They just go and copy on those expectations that we see. At the air barrier. So the question we've got is it true that the envelope always ends at the air barrier and or vapor barrier? So yes and no, right? That's a yes and no kind of question, because you can the code says it can be inside, outside, or part of the thermal envelope, right? So you may have a place that you're going to have multiple layers of control, right? Especially if we transition from, let's go back a page, right? If I'm transitioning from, this may be my thermal envelope here, and then this is going to be my air barrier, right? Because I may be transitioning from a conditioned space to a semi-heated space, right? If you think about it, if you go to maybe a Wendy's is a good example to me. Wendy's normally on the left side of the building, or on the side right here, you'll have that little entrance where they provide a respite out of the rain before a person accesses the actual conditions eating space, right? A lot of banks will do this. You'll have they'll create this vestibule. So sometimes if that's an unheated or a semi-heated space, the thermal envelope you may have more than one thermal envelope. And we'll look at one here in a second where it kind of does that same thing. So a lot of times, yes, they will be somewhat related, but it's always important to me to verify what we're looking at, right? Because this is telling me that you're showing me a thermal envelope. And so I need to understand its relationship with the air barrier. Because if we allow them a level of flexibility, right, we go from, one of the things we assume is the type of insulation, right? If that insulation is modified, is it part of my air barrier component, right? And so that becomes part of that question. So they're generally so closely related, but not always the same. Good question. Hopefully that clarified a little bit of it, makes it more muddy than it was before. And so when we start, get back to this. So when we're looking at this section, it tells me a lot about that air barrier, right? Again, this is a residential, so they're telling me the air barrier is following the residential code, right? The HVAC systems, the penetrations are going to be sealed, caulked, all that kind of stuff. This again reinforces to me the importance of putting this type of information. If all we're doing is just copying and pasting, I'm at least okay with that, because again, is a contractor going to have a copy of the energy code sitting on their desk, sitting in the trailer, sitting on site when they're out there building the next convenience store? No. But now I can go back to say, you told me, Ethan, that you build based on what's on the plans, and now this is clearly on the plan. So you need to comply with the ducts, flues have to be that penetrate the exterior or unconditioned space have to be sealed, right? So again, we start to have that conversation about, and again, we may have another good example would be if we had a thermal, envelope, and then that was part of the ceiling of a building, and then we had a cavity, a vented attic space. Our air barrier may be a different component, right? We don't know. It's potentially, you may have more than one barrier that you now have to manage and think about moisture accumulation to prevent moisture condensation within that vented attic space. One of the things that we see also on that plan is part of the responses they give us the section on building notes at the bottom, which also identifies how they're going to test, right? That a blower test shall be provided. And that this tells me what's the rate. It's going to show me that 4.4 ACH 50, right? By a third party. And I know, and we talk about approved agency versus fair, providers and that kind of thing. So we'll get into a little bit more about the testing components later on this month. But, that's one of the things we want to make sure, up front, there's a blower door test needed. So don't say I didn't know, right? again, it tells me that there's a vapor retarder. It's going to be a class 2, right? And it tells me what the testing expectations for that material are going to be, right? Penetrations will be caulked, right, at the exterior wall. They're going to be caulked so that they're water and airtight, right? We see all these different specifications. See the specification, house wrap, weather resistant barrier. We see all these different ideas identified as part of this common concept of the thermal envelope. And what we're trying to do is not only control moisture or airflow, but also moisture accumulation, right? We want to create that water resistant barrier so that it drains, it creates a drainage plane, right? So that as moisture comes in, hits our stucco, hits our exterior cladding, and starts to accumulate, are we then going to allow for moisture to penetrate and then get somehow make its way into our assembly, right? So we want to create this plane where moisture gets away. So the question in here, I recently inspected a school that had fiberglass in the exterior walls with a vapor barrier, poly vapor barrier. Some areas were not covered on the interior with drywall or some other wall. They met the R value. Does this comply? And so I would probably say most likely, probably not. It's where we start to identify what was potential other areas. Now we'll see here when we think about those barriers, because we'll show this maybe in this example. So when we think about the thermal envelope, right? That's that thing. We understand that not all insulation is the same, and so part of that is recognizing that some insulation, like a fiberglass bad insulation or fiberglass blow insulation, is capable of resisting thermal transfer, but it's not doing the air barrier control, right? That's part of what gives it its thermal resistance, is that it actually accepts in the hot air into the material, and then it fills that material, that void inside the material. That's why it's fluffy and squeezable. And so it fills that space, gets caught, captured, and then it creates the air resistance, a level of resistance. But if you blow hard enough and put enough air against bad insulation, air will move through it, right? That's where the code comes in, both in chapter 14 and in chapter 7 of the IBCs, the IRCs, and I don't remember 1305 and 1309 right off the top of my head. But what we're talking about in those codes is different classes of vapor retarders, right? Sometimes we can use a craft face fiberglass back, right? That craft face is actually the vapor retarder that comes up, stops the moisture from penetrating into because remember, moisture is bigger than air. Air in and of itself, even vapor, is a little bit thicker. And so that craft face that vapor retarder, that class 2, will stop the moisture transfer before it goes into the insulation. Once it gets the insulation, it's going to destroy the insulation and affect the studding, right? Whether we're using wood or metal, eventually it's going to rot, rust, whatever it's going to do, right? That's why we start to see the recognition. And maybe if you're using a poly, right? You're using some kind of a poly barrier, you're again resisting that moisture transfer into that space. But you also have to think about how you're doing it. If you have breaks in that continual air barrier, or in that the continuity of your vapor barrier, you're going to have areas where you're going to get moisture accumulation, right? So sometimes you may be able to utilize, the code will allow the use of class 3 vapor retarders, right? Latex paints and other materials, or as we see identified in the code, class 3 vapor retarders also come in a table. And in climate zone 6 and 7, that table includes certain types of vented cladding and continuous insulation, right? So there's the potential that maybe in the design of a building, like a school, you've got your continuous insulation behind a exterior cladding, or incorporated behind a CMU wall to provide a level of vapor resistance before you get to the insulation, right? So it all comes down to understanding that design and making sure that we understand how that design is done in the field, and making sure that we have the proper sequence of installation. It's almost like, to me, making a sandwich, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? Bread on both sides, peanut butter and jelly in the middle. Once in a while, it would not look good if we messed up that order and put the peanut butter and jelly on the outside and the bread on the middle, right? It has to be done right, or else it's just a mess. And so that's part of the understanding the importance, the relevance of proper detailing, proper design. You know, there are a variety of different materials that can be used to provide insulation, and that's why it's important. We can't just say, take out the if we put into a building, let's use the example of our school, just because not that we're picking on it, but let's say we put in a bad insulation. We identified an R20 insulation to go into that wall system, and we did not designate whether it was a rigid or spray foam versus a batten blow, right? So then we may get some modification in the field that affects more than just thermal resistance, right? I could put in 3.5 inches of polyiso and get 21, or I could put in 7 inches of bat, right? Of fiberglass. And so if I put 7.5 inches, I don't have a moisture resistant barrier. Whereas if I put in the polyiso, I would have a moisture resistant barrier. And so it's part of that understanding what level of vapor retarder we're talking about. And that what we're looking for is, again, let me jump back to this, right? We're trying to create that weather resistant barrier that exists both on the exterior wall as well as the interior wall, right? On the warm side. Because of the exterior, we've got our stucco. I don't have a great image, but we'll try and visualize. So the exterior, this is our exterior design, right? We've got some kind of exterior cladding. We've got some level of water resistant barrier so that if moisture does penetrate in, that we've got a drainage plane that allows it through flashing to get away from the building, right? And we also have a weather resistant barrier and our sheathing up against our studs and 2x4s, whatever that might be, our studs. So we're trying to create a drainage plane so where as moisture comes into contact with our cladding, whether again stucco, masonry, I mean, let's be honest, any type of studding, any type of moisture, hardboard siding, that kind of stuff, we're going to have the potential that moisture will penetrate through that system into. We've all been in a concrete building long enough. We've seen what happens when concrete gets cold or wet long enough. It'll start to move through the building, through the material. We want that drainage plane to drain away. Same concept on the interior wall. On the inside warm side of it, we're going to have drywall, right? We're going to have some kind of then most likely then we'll go straight into insulation and studs, right? Well, that's why we apply the vapor retarder on the interior surface, right? We want to make sure that we provide a class 3, maybe as a latex paint or some other appropriate compliant barrier on the interior to prevent the moisture we know exists inside the building to penetrate the other direction, right? So we've got the pressure pushing moisture into our building and pressure pushing moisture out of our building. And the thing that never gets any assistance is going to be our wall system, our assembly. And that's why it's important we identify from the very beginning all these components together, right? Because we want that insulation to resist. And somebody made the point, somebody made the point about our fiberglass, craft face fiberglass or bat insulation. This is not the proper installation, right? Because we want that craft face to cover the 2x4. Otherwise, when moisture comes in here, it's going to hit that and say, well, duh, I'm going to hit the 2x4. I'm just going to rot the 2x4 directly, right? Instead of just, accumulating. And obviously, we've got some tears and rips that are going to be problematic from moisture intrusion. That's not going to stop moisture, right? That's the point of that class 2 vapor retarder. Stop the moisture from getting in. Then it would drain out. And that's why we put class 3, depending on what we're talking about, paints and stuff on our interior spaces, not just because we've got 5-year-olds running around with crowns, but also because that's going to create moisture. If anybody has been, and I've done it more times than I tend to say I want to, I love going into vacant buildings, right? Vacant abandoned buildings. And you go into a vacant abandoned building in the normal community and you'll see moisture accumulation. You'll see the dirty drops that exist on the interior latex paints, right? Because moisture is going to naturally try and escape the interior environment to get to the outside. And so it hits that latex paint, it pools, ponds, turns to drops and drips, and it is the most awesome thing to ever see. I know I've got hundreds of pictures of interior uncontrolled moisture accumulation. But again, that kind of drives us again, understanding what is what and how is it being done. What materials are making up our air barrier? Is it going to be a vapor retarder? Is it going to be an air barrier? Those are two different concepts, right? Because vapor and air both have penetrating capabilities. And we need to understand where it is in relation to our building conditioned spaces. And then again, like we said, different types of insulation. And this is, again, where we have to reinforce the difference between open cell and closed cell, right? They both have different air permeability rates, right? You will need more open cell spray foam than you will closed cell spray foam to accomplish the same amount of both thermal resistance and air resistance, right? We see that they both have different R values for thermal resistance, but when that's in part because they have different air permeability rates. The open cell leaves a cavity open inside the cell of the polyplastic that created it. The closed cell cures faster and holds a pocket, or that cell closes earlier, and inside is the chemicals associated with the construction. So again, it's an already pre-filled space, and it's just like blowing up a balloon. You can only blow it so far. And if you leave it open, you can add more. If you close it off, it's done. You can't infiltrate. So again, we have to understand where's our thermal envelope, which may exist between all these different levels of a building. But then again, that doesn't always mean that the air barrier is going to be there, right? The air barrier may be the furthest exterior wall, right? You may not have great air control between these units. You have thermal resistance, but not air control. And that's part of the testing expectation. That's where testing comes in. So again, what we're going to look at in that building is going to be what are we using as our air barrier, our weather resistant barrier versus our air barrier, air and water barrier, right? What is it? Is a great question. And that's what we want to get from our contractor. Now, if we see this example here, I got this one here, where we've got they've given us a nice little diagram of the building, right? We've got this is a multi-use, mixed use facility, commercial on the bottom, three floors of residential, follows our commercial expectations. We see they've given us this in response. They've given us this beautiful, diagram depiction of the building thermal and air thermal envelopes. When we zoom in, we see it identifies some different, that's got a legend. It tells me where everything is. But what we see if we look is there's a little bit of a break in our continuous air barrier, our continuous thermal envelope. So that to me is one of those key things when I'm looking at the building. I'm like, okay, what are we doing here? We'll zoom in. We show an R30 batt insulation at the stair pin house, right? This is a stairway that goes up to the roof. The roof is not an occupied roof. It's just a roof with equipment on top of it. We also see down here, there's a little bit of a separation around the elevator bay, right? We've got a little bit of separation. And so that drives me to, in verifying my air barrier, to go over to the next, to find those systems, right? So I go over and I find the stair details. And then I zoom in on those stair details and I find out that they've identified the C42 and C41. Well, what does that mean? So I look at my wall units, my wall details. My wall details for C41 and 42 are 4-hour CMU walls, right? So they're using a CMU wall system. Well, this is where Josh does more work than Josh probably should. Because if you remember, one of the things that we've talked about before is that in the code identifies, let me see if I can find it real quick. Here we go. The code identifies a list of different acceptable materials that can be used to provide air leakage as part of that air leakage system, right? And one of those things identified is a concrete wall. So a concrete wall can be part of an air barrier. So part of that, and this is going to be where I'm probably nicer than I could be, should be, might be sometimes, depending on how my day's going. The air barrier is technically continuous, even though the depiction shows a break, right? Because that's not that system. 42 and 41 are both CMU walls, grouted CMU walls, right? With exterior, you got air gaps. They've got some different air barriers on the exterior. They got the 5/8 chip board, all that kind of stuff. So again, they're providing that continuity, right? This is the roof, fourth floor roof system. So again, they're providing that level of continuity. Do I go and send a comment that says as approved? Approved as noted. Probably on this one, probably not, right? But again, I'm going to verify that that's continuous. So this, again, I wouldn't send it back. I'm not a jerk. I probably wouldn't send it back. Now, if I had some comments, I would probably add it, as a note. Please note that that's not there. But yeah, it might be interior, and that's going to be it's going to have an interior paints element to it, right? And that's what we saw listed in that section of 5.4.3. Was that if it's going to be part of that? Oh, am I picking the wrong one? I might have picked the wrong slide. Jumping around, right? It's either fully grouted or painted to fill the pores, because again, what we're trying to do is resist moisture accumulation, air infiltration in that assembly. So where was it? And again, part of that is understanding what is expected in our wall design, right? How are we building these buildings? And again, that's going to be part of that critical analysis. And then what is also in the spec, right? Going back to those specs and looking for our fluid applied weather barriers versus our air barriers, right? What are we looking for in the building, and are we going to make sure that we have enough detail? Because again, that contractor is not going to have a copy of the commercial energy code. He's going to have the documents, and hopefully he has the spec book somewhere in the project, right? Most of us know that spec book is not going to be on the front page, on the front of his front seat with him, unless he's trying to hold up his coffee. But again, there are some things that we expect in that design that again are going to be all about continuity. It's going to be if we read through this section, we'll see all the different things that are expected of our air barriers. Most importantly, that's clearly identified on those documents. We need to know where it is and how we're demonstrating that it does not have, how we're properly sealing it and maintaining that air leakage control piece of our building, right? We know that the joints are going to be detailed. So we need to verify where is our air barrier, this little dotted line, and does it continue right around the building? When we go out to do the inspection and we see penetrations, that's going to be one of our, like I said, that's one of the biggest things I have problems with is, we say seal, gasket, and tape. Well, guess what? That seal, gasket, and tape isn't going to work depending on pressure differences between the interior and the exterior. So again, depending on the type of occupancy, we may have different needs for detailing when it comes to how these buildings are going to be properly designed. What do we do if we have penetrations that are complete holes, right? Do we need to refill or rebrace this area before? Or do we just put a piece of plastic over this hole, right? Put a piece of poly over it, we're done? Or do we tape it, we're done? Do we run the 5 inches of caulk across it and that's good enough? Or do we want to reinstall a piece of sheathing behind it or something that has structural static pressure resistance, right? Pressure resistance. Again, that's going to be a component or an evaluation that we do as building inspectors and as plannings examiners, thinking about how these buildings might be built on site. Talked about continuity, talked about the importance of again, airflow, jump through some things. We have continuous silicone caulk sealant, right? Silicone sealant on each side of that system. More sealing details. You see sealing details in real life, right? Penetrations, how we're going to identify air intrusion versus water intrusion, how we're protecting against it. There's a couple of them I want to show you here. You see where they've identified some sealant to go around these different flashings to, again, prevent water infiltration. I see a lot of this show up when I look at fire details, right? If I see a fire detail project, I usually take the extra step and say, if we're protecting against smoke, we're protecting against air. And so again, making sure that some of those I don't need a separate sheet. I had in this project, there was a sheet of fire stopping. I'm not going to require you to put a second sheet of air stopping, of air penetration. I'm going to verify that these different materials will qualify for air barrier control, and just let it go, right? I'm going to keep it going. If we're going to take time to protect against airflow or fire stopping and draft stopping, fire blocking and draft stopping, then again, that may work. Again, we're identifying in those notes that we have duct penetration or any penetration that goes through those different types of insulation or air barriers we want to seal against. Again, here's another one. We're talking about that hydrostatic seal, right? We're trying to resist not just a little bit of pressure. We understand this is going to, the potential is there for some type of additional pressure that may exist. Again, are we going to have some type of plastic caulk, right? We see a sealer, but then we also see that, is that going to be adequate, right? We see down here, we sleeve and caulk seal. So we have airtight control. So this is the kind of detail I'm looking for a roof penetration, especially in a commercial project. Now, residential, you don't get to see it as much because, most of that, but at the same time, you have the same expectation for compliance on that one. So we don't want to see that. Again, sitting around different ducts. We talked, I think, a couple weeks ago, maybe during one of the conversations, or maybe it was just in person. We talked about trash chutes and that kind of thing. Again, I've got a trash chute that if we could talk about, but again, it's the same concept. If we've got ducts, plenums, chutes, different assemblies that we're using, we want to make sure that they're protected against uncontrolled air movement, right? We understand there's air moving. We want to make sure that we control that air movement, and we don't just have that we maintain again either air spaces that may exist, provide sealant around certain types of areas. We just got a few more minutes. Let me see if I can jump through some stuff. Again, the code identifies not only we talk about air barriers, but also we get into weather sealing for vestibules and doors. You guys had a whole long conversation about vestibules and doors and docks and those kinds of things. But again, those exist. And so we're looking for what do those ceilings look like? What are the expectation when it comes to, I don't know why I put door schedule there, right? But we're looking for a seal at different, that's why. Look at all those cool little motions. I forgot about those. Little seals around these areas in order to resist uncontrolled airflow, right? Same thing with vestibules. We expect certain types of vestibules to allow for the control of air. That's the whole reason for the vestibule is to present and provide a level of air control, right? And we talked about the different types of materials that provide that air resistance quality to it. Again, there's a list of materials. So again, you may be able to get to a 1/2-inch exterior gyp board, could serve as a component of a air barrier if it's properly sealed, right? Precast concrete, sheet metal, certain types of foil-faced insulation boards, those kinds of things. And so part of that is understanding how they're going to operate, how they're going to be installed. Remember, when we start talking about those materials, we want to make sure they're properly installed and that they're following the manufacturer's installation instructions for both whatever they're doing, right? Commercial wrap doesn't just stop at water resistive barriers, right? It has the capacity to serve as an air barrier when it's properly installed. And again, this is where we have that conversation. Just because we say taped doesn't mean that's the solution. Is that the solution for the manufacturer? Are they using the 3-inch tape that Tyvek is identifying, right? Again, part of that conversation with the owner and with the contractor. Looking at another project here. This is another townhouse scenario project I was just working on last week. So I thought I'd throw it in. One thing I love is when I look at the index, I see energy requirements, right? Ooh, that always sounds great. So go to energy requirement page and look at what I got. Look at all that fun stuff I got. Now this is not Minnesota, so don't push me yet, right? And so that I see here that I've got a compliance path. So my compliance path tells me that I'm looking at uh, envelope trade-off, right? They've gone through the extra, they've gone that extra step. Now they've copied a lot of things verbatim. Some things are designed to tell me how that wall system is going to be designed. They've given me an idea of where that air barrier is going to be, right? That thermal envelope air barrier. When I zoom in, I can see, again, they've given me this wall certificate. Now, again, this is just a form of documentation of how the U factor gets to where it needs to be, right? So they're calculating in all the different components in that air barrier assembly, right? Or in that wall assembly. And that's how they get to their calculation, right? So this is just another resource to help add all those numbers together to show why they use 0.40 for their exterior wall, right? And so one of the things that we see, and I'm going to zoom in if I can. Oh, wrong button. And we see it identified again here in that middle section where they've got those walls above grade, and it lists all the components that are going to be a part of that wall design. So that again, I go on site, I'm expecting everything I see here in that building. If I was to keep going, I would see again in that they provide all the different instructions for their air barriers, continuity, its testing methods, its expectations, how it's going to perform. Here's another project that was using a hospital addition using the Appendix G performance. I use this when I identified this one just to reinforce why it's so important to control for air. Because what we see is part of their system design, part of their compliance is based not on meeting the proposed normal ASHRAE standard, but what is the level of air control in both their exam rooms and their surgical spaces, right? So again, they may be looking for more control than what the code requires. And so that's why air barriers are going to be a component. Now, what they've done in this plan was they combined a couple different things into one plan, and they identified these sections, these outlines of their thermal envelope, right, where the air barrier is going to be. And they also include at the bottom this detail about penetrations, right, and air barrier installation. And we see here they identified in this red dashed line, I'm losing my mouse, red dashed line, that fluid applied air barrier, right? That's the dashed line. The flat line is going to be their fire spray, right? And so they're showing the relationship between the air barrier and the fire draft, the fire blocking, right? Moving into other pages, again, we see that air barrier applied again, and we see where it's in relation, right? We see the rigid, and then we've got the fluid applied over the 5/8 jip board, right? Over the 6-inch stud with the full with bad insulation on the interior, right? So we start to see the layering that's important. So I think one of the things that we think about some of our inspection practices is, again, we need to make sure we get adequate understanding, not just for us. Obviously, we're not the one building it, but for the contractor in the field. It's not just here are all the things that go in. It's how do you build this wall the way it needs to be built for the design. Again, remember, we don't need to reinforce it a million times, but we understand that this is how buildings today are going to be built. They're going to have a level of scientific approach, building science approach to the construction practices, right? They're going to give us an air barrier coating, and it tells us how it should be applied and how it should be prepared, right? How we should protect and clean it prior to installation, there was another section. So again, all of that is under this idea that why are we doing this? Because we're trying to control air movement in our buildings, right? We're looking at that location, looking at those materials and those designs for the penetration and the testing practices, because we don't want air barriers to be an afterthought, right? We know that what we're going to see if we have this kind of a level of installation, if this is supposed to be an air barrier, well, that's not doing a very great job, right? If the foil is the air barrier. And so that's part of that process. And part of it is knowing when it's going to be how it's going to be verified, right? And we'll talk more about that testing and that visual inspection process next week when we talk about the inspection for air barriers and what that means for us as far as the proper installation of these materials for both, air barriers and insulation. Uh, Commissioning is not just something that we see only for mechanical equipment. There is provision in the code for field verification, field commissioning of our air barriers, and so it's a great, interesting conversation. Now, if you have any questions, please always let me know if you have more questions. I know we just got a few seconds left. Remember, next week we're going to talk about the inspection, then we'll get into exterior lighting design, and then we'll do some stuff on testing. Remember, for those of you that might be interested who may not have already registered or let us know you're coming, remember, it is free. But March the 26th in Hermantown, we're going to have Hope's going to be doing a half-day training from 8:30 to 12:30 up there at the city center, at the training center. So if you have any questions, let us know. Feel free to use our code helpline if you have any questions that maybe come up. Feel free to fill out your survey if there's anything that we should be teaching, talking about. Please let us know. We're trying to get ahead of our next set of training topics. And if you are interested in hosting a training in your community, for your community, again, it's free. Let us know what might make sense for you. I know we're doing some stuff for MAPMO probably in May. So again, if it's something we can do for you and your associations, your local contractors, let us know. We'd be more than happy to help out. If you do have questions, feel free to always email us individually, or if you want to use the MNECSP, Minnesota Energy Code Support Program, at shumscoda.com, that goes to the entire team, and we can respond back to you that way too. So you have a great week. Be careful. Looks like I ran a little bit over, but next week we'll have a fun conversation about what to expect while inspecting, what to expect when you inspect air barriers. You guys have a great week. I'll turn my video back on now that I don't have to worry about losing you. You guys have a great afternoon.